Okay, so let's start with reviewing where we have been so far. If you don't have one of these outlines, or if you never took a picture or wrote it down, either way, the basic flow for the whole class that we're doing based on the book called Portrait of God, it's meant to give you sort of a broad overview of how the different parts of Scripture all connect to each other. And so one of the most helpful things we can do to help us remember any sort of, I don't know if you guys can remember back to when you were in school and you had to remember, like in English Lit class, maybe some of you guys loved that class, maybe some of you hated it. I was always much better in those classes than I was at math, and that has not changed. Still better at that kind of stuff than math. But one of the best things you can do to understand a book better as you read it is to get a general idea of what's in the whole book first. And then it's easier to sort of digest the pieces because you understand where they go. You've probably done this with movies before. If you can think of, like, anybody like Star Wars, big Star Wars people, that's pretty much crowd pleaser for all generations. I know David loves Star Wars. So, Emily and Kana, how many Star Wars movies have y'all seen?
All of them.
You've seen all of them? Wow. Kana, you got some work to do. Yeah. You've seen. We went and saw one in the theater. You saw one in the theater with me.
It was part of our marriage counseling.
Yeah, okay. Well, that was when I knew Kana loved me, is that she was willing to go see Star Wars in the theater. But Star Wars is pretty famously confusing. So if somebody were going to say, I'm going to go watch a Star Wars movie now, any Star Wars nerds in the room, where do you start somebody if they're going to their first Star Wars movie? Where are you going to take them? What movie are you going to show them? 4? Okay, you're going to show them episode 4. Does it make any sense to start with 4 instead of 1? It kind of depends. We have a no, we have a yes. Anybody else start with 4? Where do you start?
Clone Wars.
Clone Wars. Oh, wow. Oh, the cartoon.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay, so deep dive here. David gets the prize for being a Star Wars nerd, for sure. Are you going to say something too?
Well, I was just going to say 4, and I'll start from the beginning.
4? Yeah, okay, so 4 is confusing. 4 is technically the first movie that was made. So the movie made in the 70s was actually, story-wise, the 4th story that's chronologically in Star Wars, and I'm going to mix it up just to, if you're trying to talk about it. So, but it's a lot easier if you watch episode 4, the original movie, A New Hope. Some of that stuff's going to make sense. Some of it's not going to make a lick of sense. But if you had seen all, 9 of the movies now, plus the cartoons, if you'd seen all of that, then you would know every last detail about everything in that movie. So we might be watching the same movie, but if I have the advantage of knowing the broad scope of the whole story, I'm going to get more out of the movie than you will. Does that make sense? Same thing with the Bible. If we are dropping in, we might think, well, it makes more sense to drop in episode 1. Might make more sense to drop in at episode 5, 6, 7, wherever it is, or maybe at the end. It's any one piece of the story makes more sense if we have the broader picture. So that's just a reminder of what we're doing with the whole class, but it's not so general that we're going to skip over important details on the way. So hopefully there's a lot of important details that we either think about harder this time around, or maybe we even address for the first time. So let's go ahead and remind ourselves, and I'm trying something fancy with this iPad today. This might just crash and burn. If it does, I'll just ignore it, and we'll put the Bible on the screen. But to fill in the outline so far, Genesis 1 and 2 was the world before sin. Told you we're getting fancy. Was the world before sin. And then that's Genesis 1:31. This is just easier than a whiteboard. Because my handwriting is so bad. That was my first thought when we did that a few weeks ago. I was thinking, I'm not doing this again. I need the iPad. Then Genesis 3 through 12. Does anybody have that one written down? You know what it was? Yep. The background of redemption. That does say redemption. This would have been, some key passages here that we actually want to read. Genesis 3:6, 3:8, and then 3:15. If somebody will turn over there to read those for us, just to help us recap. Genesis 3:6, 3:8, and 3:15.
Genesis 3:6. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree
desirable to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. She also gave to her husband with her, and he ate.
All right, thanks, Kevin. So that's the class that we should have gotten more of that information, but I got too nerding out on why Eve ate the tree, or ate the fruit from the tree. But yeah, so that's the initial background, is that humanity falls, and I think verse 8 is very important here too. Will somebody read verse 8?
Then the man and his wife heard the sound of the Lord God as he was walking in the garden in the cool of the day, and they hid from the Lord God among the trees of the garden.
Okay, thanks, Hunter. So this is the first, I guess, clue to the fact that they are separated now. God and man are separated. That is made most dramatic towards the end of the chapter. Will somebody read verse 15 for us as well?
And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel.
Okay, this is that initial, as Matt had in his notes, it's that technically, I guess, the first gospel message you read in the Bible. This is that prophecy that somebody is going to come and solve this problem that Adam and Eve have created, for not just for humanity, but for all of creation. So the very first hint that you have a solution to that is back in Genesis 3:15. That's a really good verse to circle, underline, star, highlight, whatever you want to do. But this is the first hint you get that God has a plan to redeem humanity. And it's going to be obviously the same plan throughout all of it. So technically the rest of the Bible, if you've got those first two things down in your head, which I'll show you another version of an outline in just a second. It's the same one from however many weeks ago when we talked about Adam and Eve in here. But if you get those two things down, you have set up the premise for the entire rest of the Bible. So much of what happens in the Bible is loaded into Genesis 1 through 11. If you understand your Bible better, you can read Genesis 1 through 11, get a little bit deeper. Things everywhere might make a little more sense. But you have the creation, you have the problem, and the rest of the Bible is trying to solve that problem. It's the story of God's plan to solve the problem of sin in the Garden of Eden. So when we did Genesis 12 through 50, which we finished last week, these are the classes that Eric and Kevin's previous two lessons have been on. Does anybody have that written down? Genesis 12:50?
Redemption through Abraham, Isaac,
Okay.
Jacob, and Joseph.
Okay, see, I didn't even get that right on my note. Redemption through, that's Abraham, and I'm going to cheat here. Abraham through Joseph. And we have a lot of key passages here. These we won't necessarily write all of them down because there's not room on these blanks. The initial promise, though, let's go back and remind ourselves that of Genesis 12 and verse 2. Genesis 12:2. Can somebody read that for us?
And I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and so you shall be a blessing.
Okay, so remember the core of this promise, there's really three things going on here, but the biggest thing to remember, he's going to make Abraham a great nation. He's going to take him somewhere, and he's going to bless all of the nations of the world through Abraham. So this is connecting all the way back to that Genesis 3:15. So somebody who's a descendant of Eve, so in other words, a human. A human is going to wind up crushing the head of the serpent, even though the serpent's going to bite his heel and bruise his heel. So that promise is picked up. You can also outline the whole Bible based on that promise. It's going to pick up here with Abraham through Joseph. By the time Joseph's story is over, though, we're going to wind up in Egypt. And that is what Kevin covered last week. We went a little bit through Jacob and Joseph to figure out how that promise works its way through. Their stories are fascinating, but one of the most important things from those two classes, I think, Abraham, as great as he is not the one who crushes the head of the serpent. Same thing with Isaac, same thing with Jacob, same thing even with Joseph. Now, Joseph does some pretty great stuff. You know, we all know the story of Joseph, I would imagine, especially because we were in here for class last week. Our minds have been jogged about who Joseph was and what he did. He looks a lot like a serpent crusher, if we can use that phrase, because he's done some pretty great things during his time. He's had to go through a lot. He suffered a lot, but he did some really great things, not just for Israel. You remember when he stocks up that food, who gets to benefit from the food that Joseph stockpiles? Yeah, everybody. All the nations. So through Joseph, all the nations of the world have been blessed. But he's still not the guy. And as we move forward into Exodus 1, we're going to get closer to the guy today. So when we pick up in Exodus chapter 1, we are letting off right at the tail end of Genesis 50. These two go together chronologically. They're obviously together in the Bible, but they go together, and one story leads to the next one. Okay, so really quickly though, let me show you this too. This is what we did a couple weeks ago. Whoop, need a C, not a G. If you're like me and your brain is not strong enough to hold these things in your memory all at once, and I'm still working on it. I've been working on it since you gave me this outline, Kevin.
Me too.
But if your brain, that's a lot of numbers. I don't memorize numbers very well. And this is chopped up at the bottom, sorry. But if that's a lot, that's too much to memorize. I'm still working on it. Let me show you a really, really simple way to organize the whole story of the Bible, and I'll show you where this plugs in today. So you have creation. You already know where that's at. It's in Genesis 1 and 2. Like any good Church of Christ lesson, we're going to alliterate here. Crisis. That goes from Genesis 3 to 11. So things in this section are Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, the flood, and the Tower of Babel. So the rebellion of humanity, and it's kind of tough to say it's at its height in any of these sections, because they all emphasize different things about the sin of humanity. But at least with Babel, it's the first time that humanity's not shy about like trying to be among the gods, at the very least. So the Tower of Babel is extremely important. Almost, I guess some people say it reaches its height, but that's kind of hard to say. But everything sets up here in the first 11 chapters, and this is where we are now, is in the covenant. And technically, everything from Genesis 12 onward counts as the covenant, because even into Christ is a fulfillment of the covenant with Abraham. So technically, if you can get those three down, you got the whole Bible. But if you want a little bit stronger, then this fourth one is Christ, who comes as the fulfillment of that covenant. We already know this. We learn about him in Matthew to John. Two more. What you see on the screen is different than what I'm seeing on my iPad. I've got more of it for some reason. You have the age of the church. You learn about the history of the church in Acts. You learn a lot about the teachings of the church. And a lot of the things about Christ are explained in this fifth section. And then the last one would be consummation. And that's in Revelation. Not all of Revelation is about the end of time, but some of it is. That's a little bit easier to stick in our brains, I think. And look at this, you got 3 in the Old Testament, 3 in the New Testament. So that helps too. So if you can remember creation, Christ's covenant, you've got the basic storyline of the whole Old Testament done. And it also helps because the covenant is still open. Like it's not finished yet. It's not fulfilled. So when you get to the New Testament, technically these could all be bullet points under that. But to help us be a little more specific, I guess, you have Christ, church, and consummation. So where we are now is in one of the most pivotal moments here in Exodus 12, 1 to 2. This is one of the most important moments in that covenant section. Major checkpoints, obviously, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and then Moses. It's really hard to overstate the importance of Moses to the overall storyline of the Bible. So the major thing for the line item today is slavery in and judgment on. I think technically you can do judgment with an E or without an E in the middle. One of them's like British and one of them's American. I don't know which is which though. Slavery and judgment in Egypt is the next section. So that's what we're going through today. So we're making progress. We got 4 blanks done. I think there's 21 blanks. So we're scooting through. Okay, so two big sections that we'll go through today. Hopefully, if we have time. I hope I haven't wasted too much time in preamble, introduction stuff. But we'll talk about the slavery in Egypt and then the judgment on Egypt. Now, I'm going to guess this is pretty well familiar to a lot of folks. We'll kind of give the top level view, but if you've got any extra reflections or any thoughts or points of application that you want to share, feel free to slow us down. And I can just make up that time difference somewhere else. So, wanted to give maybe a helpful outline for this whole section in Exodus 1 through 2. So let's go to the growth of Abraham's promise in the first part of the book. Two passages here. We're going to look at Acts 1 wow, I got that very wrong. 7:14. And then this is where I got confused. Exodus 1:7. What do y'all see on the screen? Okay. I can see all that on my iPad, so let me fix it over here. Okay, now you can see the red box. Not all of it. Okay, there we go. Can somebody read Acts 7:14 for us?
Then Joseph sent and called his father Jacob and all his relatives to him, 75 people.
Okay, so how many people go into go into Egypt with Joseph?
75.
Okay, 75. So it's either 75 total or it's, okay, yeah, there we go, 76, because Joseph goes with him. So, in other words, not a whole lot of people. Exodus 1:7. Can somebody read that?
But the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly, multiplied and grew exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them.
Okay, so that promise that God made to Abraham that you will become a great nation, they've gone from 75 to now they've multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, and the land is filled with them. We don't get an exact number, but there's a bunch. And by the time they leave, there's different estimates of how many it would be, but suffice it to say, there's a whole lot of people, okay? They're going to wind up leaving, but well, I don't want to get too far ahead. We'll keep going. Okay, so then after they grow, they expand, there's a new Pharaoh in verse 8 that rises in Egypt that didn't know Joseph. And when he addresses the state of his kingdom, he notices that the Israelites have grown to be very strong. So especially here, we're going to see, I'm just going to put VB for verses, especially verses 8 to 10. So if somebody can read that for us.
And there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, Look, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply and happen in the event of war, that they also join our enemies and fight against us, and so go up out of the land. Okay, thanks, Kristen. So the idea is, new Pharaoh shows up. He doesn't know about Joseph. He doesn't have that positive attitude about the people of Abraham. So he says we're going to make them our slaves so they don't wipe us out. Which, from Pharaoh's perspective, he doesn't know Yahweh. I mean, it's not a bad idea from Pharaoh. I don't want these people to wind up taking over my nation. So we got to do something to make sure they don't rise up against us. So he puts them under subjection to them. But then in verse 12, I believe also is the next verse, we're going to read, look what happens to them. In spite of that, what happens to them in verse 12? Okay, they multiply. The more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. So verse 7, they had increased and multiplied. Verse 12, the more they're oppressed, the bigger the people group gets. So what a really cool lesson in and of itself. And if time allowed, we could really get into that. But isn't it so incredible that in their oppression, there's still so much growth? And through that, well, really, the whole story of Israel under Egyptian rule here is tragic in a lot of ways, especially so here with the massacre of the babies that are born. But even through something like that, that promise of God is still being brought to fruition. So even though, and if you can kind of put yourself in the shoes of the parents of Moses, what they would have felt raising a child, and having a boy, because back in ancient times, when you got pregnant, there's no way for you to find out what the gender of that baby is. There's not an ultrasound in the Old Testament times. So can you imagine the anxiety of being pregnant and not knowing if your child was going to be ripped out of your arms and thrown into the Nile for 9 months. And then when the baby's born, it is a boy. And now I'm sure you've made a plan to hide the kid if it was a boy. So now you got to activate the plan and keep him hidden for all these months. I mean, be a lot of stress and anxiety, but even through some terrible tragedies and awful moments like that, God is still making good on his promise. And that promise is not just being stalled off into the future, it's happening right in the moment. Like the people are growing as the time goes on through the oppression. So really encouraging for us, even if I feel like I'm stuck somewhere here, God's promises are still coming to fruition, no matter what. So I can have some hope and some confidence. So really cool message there. But then Pharaoh's massacre. We're really familiar with this when he decides we're going to take all of the males born to the Hebrews and kill them as soon as they're born. That's going to be our way of essentially doing population control now, because slavery didn't work. They're actually growing more. They're getting stronger. So we're going to have to actually take some of them out. Let's just not let them grow anymore. Let's take out all of their male children. A really interesting thing to note here is in verses 17 to 21. Can anybody give us a quick summary of what happens when he tells all the midwives to take the Hebrew males and kill them? What do the midwives do? Does anybody remember? Okay, they don't do it. They're not willing to do it. And then what happens to them because they won't do it? God blesses them and gives them families in these verses here. So this is funny because Pharaoh's already being undermined. And the book of Exodus is a lot about God versus the gods of Egypt, and God getting glory over the gods of Egypt is one of the major themes in Exodus among several others. Some that might be a little more important, obviously, to the story. But Pharaoh's already undermined at the very beginning by just some of his servants, which is kind of funny, certainly as you move through the book and see how much more he's undermined, not just by the authority of God, but by even the people in the lowest positions in his kingdom. The midwives are the first ones here. His daughter is going to do it in the next section. So we have it set up here, but in verse 22, this command extends to who? Who's supposed to take the Hebrew males and throw them in the river in verse 22?
Anybody.
Okay, yeah, he gives the command to all the Egyptians. Now, presumably the soldiers are the ones that are going to be actually taking charge. But now there's responsibility for me as the average Egyptian citizen. If I know of a Hebrew baby boy, maybe I'm not the one that's actually grabbing it and tossing it into the Nile, but I'm at least going to go, report and have that baby killed. So you're living in a time of intense turmoil if you are a Hebrew living under Egyptian slavery. And then we have the story of Moses' birth, where we are going to start seeing the hope that God has given to Israel to come out of this. So let's also reference here, if I can write correctly. Let's reference Hebrews chapter 11, verse 23. If somebody will read that for us. Hebrews 11:23. Anybody that can read.
By faith Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents, because they saw that the child was beautiful, and they were not afraid of the king's edict.
Okay, thanks, Copeland. So, what's interesting here, Moses, this is one of the only times in Hebrews 11, everybody's familiar with that chapter, I'm guessing? We call it the Hall of Faith. A lot of people from the Old Testament are mentioned. I know you are laughing about the edict over there. Y'all give them a break. Give them a break. I know.
Killing me.
I know, I can't focus now because I'm laughing at him, laughing at you. So we got to get that out of the way. Hebrews 11:23 though, who's credited for their faith in that verse? Yeah, his parents. So Moses' parents are actually the ones who give Moses a chance to actually be that deliverer. Now, if it wasn't Moses, God would have raised up someone else, obviously. We're not saying if his parents hadn't done this, Israel would have never been saved. God's the one in control here, not Moses. But God would have had to raise up another if his parents proved to be faithless. So another great message here for application for us if we were kind of going in that direction today, but we're trying to really get the story in our heads more so. But we don't want to ignore the fact that Moses' parents trusted in God much more than they feared Pharaoh. And I'm sure they had some level of respect and fear for what Pharaoh could do to them, but it was negligible compared to their faith in God. And so they're not afraid to undermine Pharaoh, just like the midwives did here. They didn't care. Moses' parents are also undermining that command. They don't care either. And so one interesting thing that Matt pointed out that I want to point out too is that the deliverer for the Hebrews, in other words, the person that's going to bring God's judgment on Egypt, grows up in the palace of Egypt. And that's some pretty cool irony, I think, from the very beginning. The one who's going to be responsible for their punishment, they're actually caring for him and raising him in their own house. And then Moses is going to come back and bring judgment on them. So it's just interesting, certainly, how the plans of God work here. So then Moses flees to Midian. He's there for 40 years. You can actually divide the life of Moses into these 40-year periods. And it's a really neat, clean way to organize it, easy to remember. But he leaves Egypt because, everybody knows the story, right? Why does he leave Egypt? What did he do? Yeah, he killed a guy. He killed one of the Egyptian taskmasters. But do you remember why he killed him?
He was beating a slave.
Okay, he was beating a slave. There's one more detail here, though. It's really important to notice. He's an Egyptian taskmaster beating one of the slaves. Why does Moses, as an Egyptian, though, care about that? Why does he care? His people. He sees it happening among his people. So Moses is aware of who he is. He knows his heritage. It's not like he learns this after he runs away into Midian and finds out he needs to come back and help. At some point early in his life, well, he knew his mother. He would have certainly known his mother. He knows his heritage. He knows his background. And he doesn't leave Egypt, though, just because he's scared of getting caught by Pharaoh. Hebrews chapter 11. Let's go back there. Hebrews 11:24, the very next verse. Why did Moses leave Egypt? Okay, say it again.
It had been known that he had killed the Egyptians.
Yep. So there's this practical element of he needs to flee because he's in trouble. But we don't want to say that his flight from Egypt was just cowardice. Hebrews 11:24 tells you why the bottom level reason he left Egypt. Will somebody read that for us, please?
By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter.
Sorry, can you read verse 25 and 26 also?
He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to obey the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt because he was looking ahead to his reward.
All right, sorry, Thomas, one more, verse 27.
By faith he left
But I'm not going to push you further.
Not fearing the king's anger, he persevered because he saw him who is invisible.
Okay, so why did he leave Egypt? Verse 27. Not because he was afraid of the anger of the king, right? So we know he didn't leave just because he was scared, although certainly the practical element is there. Why does the writer of Hebrews say he left?
Saw him who is invisible.
Okay, yeah, it's by his faith. So he knows, and he willingly rejects the life he has in Egypt. It's not like it's taken from him. And we read this quickly and we go through it, we think, man, if he hadn't killed that Egyptian, would he have just stayed there? Would he have just kind of remained Egyptian and tried to help in ways that he could? He didn't have his life as an Egyptian robbed from him because he made a mistake. And so then he lost his Egyptian status. He had to run away. It's a decision, a conscious decision he makes by faith to reject. Because I'm sure he could have stayed and tried to work this out. He might could have even stayed and served some kind of sentence. But if he's a grandson to Pharaoh, do you think he's going to be held accountable for killing an Egyptian taskmaster? You don't think they can cover that up somehow?
Yes, if Pharaoh wanted to kill him.
If Pharaoh wanted to, yes. He certainly could have.
It said he wanted to, that's why Moses fled.
Okay, yes. But there's certainly Moses, from Hebrews 11, it looks like Moses has a conscious decision to make. He has a choice. And he decides to leave not just the punishment from Egypt, he decides to leave the riches and the treasures and all that stuff from Egypt. It's not taken from him. He makes a conscious decision to leave in Hebrews 11. And then when we get to the end of this section in chapter 2, this is after Moses flees out to Midian, we're brought all the way back to the promise of Abraham. So let's read verses 23 through 25 together here. That requires somebody to read it out loud.
Now it happened in the process of time that the king of Egypt died. Then the children of Israel groaned because of the bondage, and they cried out. And their cry came up to God because of the bondage. So God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and with Jacob. And God looked upon the children of Israel, and God acknowledged them.
Okay, so this to me is a very important detail, but it's also just, for lack of a better term, it's cool that the writer drops back this nugget to say, okay, it's a different story because it's Moses, but it's a continuation of the promise made to Abraham. And these kinds of little breadcrumbs are everywhere in the Bible. They are everywhere. Some of the names that get dropped the most are Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's very familiar. Those three names are going to show up a lot in Exodus, in the story about Moses. Those three names are going to show up a lot. After this, Moses is a name that appears a lot. After that, David is a name that's going to appear a lot. And those 5 names in particular are going to be repeated many times in the Gospels, in the teachings of Jesus, and then certainly throughout about how Jesus fulfills the promises made to each one of these. And there's some even back to, I don't have a 6th finger though, there's some all the way back to the serpent in the Garden of Eden as well. So they all connect. They're not just different stories that you learn, okay, I'm going to file this under Moses, this under Abraham, this under Christ. There's a lot of overlap between the promises that they are given, the promises that they fulfill, and certainly how these figures in Scripture function. If I can go back here for a second without messing everything up. How they all fit into that story. So what we should be able to do, in theory, by the end of the class, is take somebody like Moses, or maybe even one of the kings, one of the random kings of Israel. Might not even remember their names are, but if we can remember where they fit into the big storyline and how they fit into the scheme, then all of a sudden, the Bible's not just a collection of random facts that might have some spiritual application for us if we look hard enough. The Bible then becomes a cohesive story about God's redemption, not just of the people here, but of me as well. So that's, I think, again, to bring us back to the bottom line. Any other thoughts on the slavery in Egypt before we move to the next box? We got 10 minutes. Does anybody have any thoughts about God staying faithful through a difficult time, like we had read here? Any reflections on, the feelings that either Moses or his parents would have had, or just how about your average Israelite living through this time, knowing that they have the promises of Abraham, that they're going to be this great nation, they're going to bless the earth, but what they're seeing in front of them is continued decline under the power of Egypt. That's a great comment. That's a great thought. Everybody write that down. You know what's funny is like a full 15 minutes into class before I realized it was a baby. I thought there was something like creaking back there. I'm like, they not just stay still in their chair. Yeah, that's great comments though. Those are great comments. Yes?
I think it's interesting that so many, probably thousands, maybe millions of people were part of this plan and never saw it. And we get to see all of it and how amazing it is. But also that we may be part of a plan that we will never see the end of it. Maybe our children, our grandchildren, great-grandchildren will do something that God has been planning for them that we'll never see.
Okay, now that's awesome, because they are living at the beginning of this and they never see that. So that's the idea. So we are living here now, and before we die, we might not see this either. So I think that's really insightful and very, very encouraging. So in some ways, we can be in a very similar boat. I think that's awesome. Yes, ma'am.
And we're focusing on the spiritual, but even on the everyday stuff. I mean, before they were slaves, they were nomads. They learned how to make bricks and stuff and how to build while they were in Egypt. So when they got to the promised land, they were able to build their houses and stuff.
Yeah, so even
the
through
practical side of it, while they were there, they learned something that they could use later on.
Yeah, so God can take even our negative situations in life and give us a benefit from them. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's James 1 for sure. Yeah, go ahead.
I think the parallel is interesting between the Israelites in slavery multiplying rapidly, the more they're persecuted,
Yeah.
and the more they're oppressed. And then you look in the 1st century, 2nd century, 3rd century, the
Yeah.
church does the same thing. Its extreme growth is at the point at which its persecution is at its highest.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. That's all. This is making me think of James 1. You know, consider it all joy when you go through trials of various kinds, knowing that those trials will produce steadfastness, and ultimately that steadfastness will make you perfect and complete. So yes, there is not just the resilience you gain by hanging in there, but the blessings along the way as God is continuing to fulfill his promise through that hardship. That's really good, yeah. And I think gives us a whole different kind of ability to have peace when we do go through difficult things. Because it's very hard, and I would imagine everybody in this room has been through a period in your life where you've struggled with one thing or another in terms of, you know, difficulty or tragedy, something like that. And it's one thing to experience that and have somebody just come and give you a pat on the back and say, well, you know what? Just don't worry about it. It's okay. You know, there's a side of you that might, okay, maybe, but it definitely doesn't feel that way right now, you know, and so we don't necessarily feel like that's an easy way to get some comfort or to get some growth. But if we are aware and our faith in God allows for things like this to happen in my life that do not negate the reasons I have for hope and comfort and peace in life. So, for example, if my view of God requires that God would never allow this to happen to Christians in the United States, and if that happened to Christian male babies in the U.S., I would lose my faith in God because he can't be real. Because God only makes good things happen to his people. So if bad things like that happen, guess what? Not only do I lose my son, I lose God. I lose my faith in God. Not because God left me, but because I left God. Now how are you going to get through that? You see what I'm saying? But if you go through this and your view of God is one that allows, look, things might happen, but that is in no way an evidence against the goodness or the power of God. God's still working his plan and his promises no matter what the enemy does. The enemy never wins. So even if I feel the intense grief of loss there, like Paul says in Thessalonians, I can grieve, but not as those who have no hope. I still grieve, and these people still grieved. I mean, this is referred back to in Matthew. Somebody will have to check me on this, on what that scripture is, but there's that loud weeping when this happens with Herod and when he's after Jesus and he kills all the kids. So they still weep. They're still grieving, but it's not a grief without hope. They recognize that God is still there and God's still working. And that's, you know, it's hard to think of messages that would have more power in our lives than a message like that, because that gives us something that we can take to get through any difficulty that life shows us. All here in the story of slavery in Egypt. Okay, 5 minutes. 4, actually. We can go through this quick. Oh, I'm not supposed to change the slide. I'm supposed to just move. Okay, so Moses is called. Very, very quickly, we'll say, especially 3:1 through 8, you can read about the call. Moses initially rejects his call, maybe because he's humble, probably because he's humble, actually. But maybe because he's also pretty intimidated and just doesn't, you know. Quite frankly, it's not just humility. He's just accurately assessing the situation. Because Moses, for all intents and purposes here, he has never been trained as a military commander, so he's literally unable to fight Pharaoh. If just Moses goes back to Egypt to deliver the Israelites, are they brought out of Egypt? No, they are not. If it is just Moses, without God behind him, Moses is going to die pretty quickly. And in fact, his people would have even rejected him after that first, bricks without straw, right here in chapter 5. Because they weren't happy with him here. And they're like, just leave us alone. We'd rather go back to what we had before. Which is wild, because what you had before was your babies being massacred by Pharaoh. You really want to go back to that. You wouldn't rather leave. And they keep saying that when they get out, but that'll be for later. But then Egypt's judgment gets pronounced on them in chapter 4, verses 22 to 23. We skipped over something in this first section. We also want to see the name of God I'm going to run out of room here. The name of God in verses 13 to 15. We have seen the name of God in the Bible before, but this is the first time one of the figures in Scripture is told the name of God. So in the story, it's the first time the name of God is revealed to the people of Israel. And it's really, really hard to make too big of a deal of that moment. And I know Colt's got a lot of thoughts on this too. So if you got questions about this, come see Colt. But this is one of the major themes. We had a good conversation about that. This is one of the major themes in the book of Exodus, that God reveals himself, not just to Israel, but to everybody. And that's a main point of the deliverance and the plagues. It's repeated over and over and over. You will know, you will know, you will know. The Egyptians will know, Pharaoh will know, all of the nations will know. So it's this big idea of people knowing about who God is. But the judgment itself is pronounced in verses 22 to 23. I don't have any extra notes there. And then there's this really weird story in verses 24 to 26. And if somebody here has all the answers to this, I would love to hear those. I guess we don't have time. We have 2 minutes. But this is a really weird story. Oh, no way. We still have 2 minutes. Okay. How far behind are we? Well, at least, so I tried to cheat today, Kevin, if you can't tell. I put everything on the board so we could at least write it all down even if I didn't make it. So even though we didn't make it, we still kind of made it.
That's good.
Hey, but don't lie. I got a lot further than you thought I would, didn't I?
You're right.
So I did better. How many chapters did we get through? 2? 3? Almost 4? That's a world record for me. But this one is really weird because God's about to kill Moses here. If you haven't read that, God is seeking to kill Moses, just reading the story out of nowhere. It's just, okay, and then Moses went here and God sought to kill him. What? You just sent him back, but he didn't circumcise his son. And even though the law is not in effect here, you remember what he told Abraham about circumcision being a mark of the covenant? So that's something that included the promise to Abraham. It precedes the law of Moses. So in case there's any confusion of, well, this wasn't a law yet, why do you have to do it? Well, it was part of the covenant with Abraham, and God's very serious. So this reminds us, it's a good place to end. Moses is a guy. He is a deliverer for Israel. He is not the guy. He is not the deliverer. He's still imperfect. He does not follow the will of God perfectly. His wife saves his life here. He would have been dead if not for her. But Jesus is not like that. Jesus, as the actual serpent crusher, he is perfect. He is the deliverer, not just for Israel, but for everybody. Any last comments as we leave? All right. Thanks, everybody. That was fun. Enjoying this study. Next week is the next blank, and maybe they'll get through it.